Sarah Davis is a 7th grade student at Bayshore Middle School in Leonardo, New Jersey. Sarah is in an ICS setting for all of her core academic subjects. Sarah was due for her reevaluation in February 2021. In January 2021, Sarah took the Woodcock-Johnson Ford Test Form A when she was 11 years old and in 6th grade. The purpose of this test is to identify strengths and weaknesses. The sections allow for diagnosing and monitoring a student's progress in reading, writing, and mathematics. In this assessment, Sarah needed to read words aloud without defining them. She had to silently read a sentence and then determine what word in that sentence should go in the blank. And she had to read a sentence and determine, based on a question, whether the answer was yes or no. For the math section, she had to answer as many 2-digit addition and subtraction problems as she could in 3 minutes. Additionally, she had to solve as many multiplication and division problems as she could in 3 minutes. The multiplication and division did get increasingly more difficult as she went on. We started off as 1-digit numbers, and then as she went through the page, it became 2-digit. No percentiles and composite scores were noted when I specifically asked for them. The case manager said even with parent permission, legally she's not allowed to give out certain testing scores. She tested superior in written expression, average in word letter identification and sentence fluency, and low in understanding directions, sentence repetition, comprehension, and vocabulary. The second test she took was the next day, so again, she was 11 years old and in 6th grade. This was the comprehensive test of phonological processing, where the purpose was to assess a student's strengths and weaknesses in phonological awareness, phonological memory, rapid symbolic naming, and rapid non-symbolic naming. On this assessment, Sarah needed to remove phonological segments from a given word to form a new word. She had to take individual sounds that were given to her and put those sounds together to make words. And she was given a word, and she had to break that word up into different phonological segments. She had to do this. Some of the words were real words that she knew, and some of the words were not real words. So the tester noted that the words that were not real were more of a challenge for her. She was then given a series of numbers, and after a 3-minute break, she had to repeat those numbers back to the assessor. She also had to listen to a non-word and accurately repeat that non-word back to the assessor. She was shown a page of letters, and she had to quickly name those letters back. This was also done with numbers and colors. The assessor did note that during this time, there was a lot of foot traffic going in and out of the guidance office, so she was very easily distracted. Finally, she was shown pictures of different objects, and she had to quickly name the objects. Sarah scored a composite score of 100, which is average for blending words and phenome isolation. She got a composite score of a 92, which is average for rapid letter naming and rapid digit naming. Lastly, she scored a composite score of 82, which is below average for short-term and working memory. No percentiles were noted. The tester did note, however, that memory appeared to be a weakness for her. The third assessment that she took was the full-scale IQ test, more specifically, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children Series 5 test. The purpose of this test is to find an IQ for the student so that it can be compared to other students her age. For this test, there are 5 sections. The first was verbal comprehension. This had 2 subsections. The first section was vocabulary, where she was given a word and she had to define it. The second section was she had to determine a similarity between 2 words. So the assessor could say something like red or blue, and she had to say they're both colors. The next part of the assessment was visual spatial, where she was given physical blocks. Some of the sides of the blocks were all red, some of the sides of the blocks were all white, and some were half red and half white. She was then shown a picture of a pattern, and she had to maneuver those blocks to match that pattern. She had 3 minutes to do this. The next part of the assessment was fluid reasoning. Here, she was given a pattern. Some of the patterns had to do with colors. Some of the patterns had to do with numbers and letters. She had to figure out what the pattern was and continue that pattern. The next part was processing speed. For this section, she was given symbols that were attached to a number. On the bottom of the page, there was that number with a box underneath it. She had to determine, for example, what the symbol was for number 1, and she had to draw that symbol in the box, and she had to do as many as she could in 3 minutes. The last section was working memory, which had 2 subsections. The first section was visual, where she would look at an iPad, she looked at a picture, and the assessor would turn the iPad off, and she had to describe back what that picture was. The second section was auditory. The assessor gave her a series of numbers, and she had to repeat those numbers back forward, she had to repeat them back backward, and she had to repeat them back in sequential order. It was determined that her IQ was 65, which is in the impaired range. This is in the 37th percentile, but the tester did note that memory seemed to be her weakest point. She scored average in verbal comprehension, she scored average in visual spatial, average in fluid reasoning, average in processing speed, but low in working memory. The last test she took was the Linkit assessment, which is given in her English class 3 times a year. First in the beginning of the year, second in about February, and last at the end of the year. So the numbers that I'm going to be giving to you are her results from February. She was in 6th grade and 11 years old. On the Linkit assessment, students need to read a fiction text and answer comprehension questions. Some questions required the students to give textual evidence. Students were also given a nonfiction text and were asked to do the same thing. Some of the questions did involve describing the plot of the story, describing the characters and the characters' viewpoints, describing how characters respond to change in a novel, and there were also some vocabulary questions. Some of the vocabulary questions did have context with it, and some of the questions did not have context. Sarah was strong with identifying the meaning of unknown words with context clues. She scored 14 out of 15 on this section, and she was also strong with analyzing the text structure of a nonfiction. She scored a 13 out of 15 on this section. She tested average in identifying the theme of a fiction novel, scoring a 10 out of 15. She was weak in citing text evidence and determining the main idea of the story, getting a 6 out of 15 on those parts. She was also weak in determining the characters' viewpoints. This was also a 6 out of 15. In a fiction text, Sarah was weak in describing the plot of a story, getting a 6 out of 15. She's weak in describing how a character responds to change, answering only 4 out of 15 questions correct. She was weak in identifying unknown words, citing text evidence, which was a 5 out of 15. And she was also weak in explaining viewpoints, scoring a 5 out of 15 on that section as well. There are no overall scores were given. When I had asked the English teacher about this test, she said that they really look on colors. There's no scores, there's no percentiles. They really look at the color. A dark green is exceeding expectations. If the score is in a light green, it's meeting expectations. If it's an orange, it's kind of on the bubble. If it's yellow, they're approaching to meet expectations. If it's a light red, they're partially meeting expectations. And if it's a dark red, they're not meeting expectations at all. Based on these scores, it can be concluded that Sarah is weak in reading comprehension, vocabulary, short-term memory, and working memory. Her ability to understand verbal directions are inconsistent, as she was high on the IQ test in this section, but low on the Woodcock-Johnson. One area of strength seems to be written expression. She appears to struggle in reading both fiction and nonfiction readings, but seems to be slightly stronger with the nonfiction readings. Due to her low IQ, multiple areas of weakness, and the notes of her inability to maintain attention, she was diagnosed with the inattentive type of ADHD, which makes her eligible for special education services. Those services include her being placed in an ICS setting for all of her core academic subjects.